Hello, I'm Dr. Emily David. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at Hampshire Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. Welcome to this e-learning package on eating disorders. It's aimed at professionals who work with or who support young people who experience eating disorders and their families. I'll be delivering this e-learning package with my colleague.
Hi, my name is Dr. Ian Rodd. I'm a consultant general paediatrician working in Winchester for Hampshire Hospitals Foundation Trust.
This e-learning package consists of 6 different parts. The first part is a general introduction to eating disorders in children and young people. We'll be focusing on what's the context and why is this important for you to know about this. Part 2 considers the evolution, so the causes and/or risk factors related to eating disorders. Part 3 will be focused on how do eating disorders present in children and young people. So what are we looking for, what impact do they have, and what does it feel like to have an eating disorder? Part 4 will be focusing on the practical approaches and techniques for supporting a young person with an eating disorder. Part 5 will be considering the physical health and the medical management. We'll be thinking about the role of paediatrics and the role of specialist mental health hospital provision. Part 6 is ARFID, that is, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder in children and young people. Part 1, a general introduction to eating disorders in children and young people. An eating disorder is a serious mental illness that involves a person developing thoughts, feelings, and eating behaviour that can take over a person's life and make them really unwell. Eating disorders can involve eating too much or too little and becoming really unhappy, worried, and preoccupied with things such as their weight and their shape. It's important to remember that lots of people worry about what they look like and from time to time might be unhappy with their weight or shape. But for somebody with an eating disorder, these thoughts and feelings can have a serious impact on their life. It can impact on their physical health, education, and general daily living, such as hanging out with their friends, spending time with family, going out and taking part in activities. And for some people, an eating disorder can become life-threatening. Exact figures of prevalence are tricky to establish as many people are undiagnosed or are not under the care of an eating disorder service. Therefore, the statistics that we do have are likely to be an underestimate. The Department of Health have estimated that actually the true figure for those affected is more likely to be close to 4 million people. Anyone of any age can develop an eating disorder, including children in primary school as well as adults through the lifespan into older adulthood. However, the largest group of people that an eating disorder typically affects are those aged between around 14 to 25 years. Recovery from an eating disorder can be lengthy, with the average duration of anorexia being approximately 8 years and for bulimia 5 years. Just under 50% of those with anorexia and bulimia make a full recovery, with about a third making some improvement, whilst approximately 20% remain chronically unwell. Sadly, eating disorders, specifically anorexia nervosa, are associated with the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder in adolescents, with approximately 20% of deaths as a result of suicide, and many more engage in self-harm.
One of the challenges we face as professionals is it would be really nice if we could have a nice tight set of guidelines to always tell us what to do. And sometimes guidelines are really, really helpful. In my own world, for instance, a guideline for asthma is really helpful. One of the things I've had to learn about eating disorders is it's really easy to write a guideline and really hard to learn how to look after eating disorders. And I think the reason for this is best explained when we think about learning a game of chess. You could learn the rules for the game of chess within an hour or two. But for most of us, to actually really become good at playing a game of chess is going to take us a lifetime to learn all the strategies and all the little minutiae. What I think is helpful is to have a few basic rules and guidelines, and then through the medium of talks like this, we can start thinking about some of the strategies that tend to be helpful. But what we know is that they only tend to be helpful most of the time. And what we actually find is that we have to adapt what we're doing around the situation of the young person that we're trying to look after.
Now we're going to hear from some young people who are going to share their personal experience of what it's like living with an eating disorder.
Having an eating disorder, it can be quite a weird thing to kind of describe, and I think at different points in my journey it felt very different. My mum would very consistently would say it was like I was possessed, and I think I think that is kind of the best way to describe what it is like. This other voice, for me at least, it did come across as this whole other kind of personality, this whole other voice that kind of just arrived in my brain. And it did make me do things that I didn't necessarily want to do. And as the eating disorder developed, that voice did get a lot bigger and a lot scarier and a lot more controlling, to the point where myself was just a very small segment in my mind that didn't have any kind of control on what I did or what I said or what I ate or what I did. It's definitely a very scary illness. Like, there'd be times where I didn't necessarily know why I was doing those things, and it didn't always make sense to me why I was doing what I did, but it just felt like that's what I should be doing. It felt safe, or it felt right, or sometimes it was just out of habit. Sometimes I know when it came to eating, sometimes it would feel like there was this almost like this wall kind of preventing me from eating. Like, physically I wouldn't be able to like pick up that fork or that sandwich or something. There was just something physically holding me back. So as much as I wanted to eat or drink or whatever, there was something that was literally holding me back, and I just could not do that. I think as I started to recover, that voice and that proportion of my mind did get smaller. I think there was a constant battle though between me and those voices. I think as my journey developed and I worked through some issues and trauma I'd gone through, there were different voices that kind of told me different things and kind of had different beliefs about myself, and it was these that kind of fed into how I saw me and my body and my self-worth and how I related to other people. As I started to have certain treatments, I began to think a lot more clearly and was at a healthy weight, which is also very important for recovery as well. I began to think a lot clearer and began to kind of distinguish those thoughts that weren't me, that I didn't necessarily believe in. And as my life began to kind of continue, I began to kind of question what those voices were telling me. So as I recovered more, those voices and what they were telling me got a lot quieter, and the control they had over me got a lot less, and me got a lot bigger, and I began to kind of control my life again, to the point where those voices just didn't exist anymore. So that's, in my experience at least, what it felt like having an eating disorder.
Having an eating disorder is like being in a bubble and no one really knowing you're in the bubble and no one being able to reach you. I remember, do you mean more emotionally or physically or both?
However you want to interpret that.
I think emotionally, it felt very much like an addiction. I was very heavily reliant on the eating disorder, and I couldn't imagine life without it. I couldn't imagine life where I didn't know the calories in absolutely anything I was going to consume, a life without counting everything, a life without kind of spending every single waking moment and sleeping moment thinking about food. You get so obsessed with food that I dreamt about food, and I would sit in class and I wouldn't be listening because I'd be thinking of my next meal or rather how to avoid the next meal or how I was going to get in my exercise. And it's just completely all-consuming. Like, I didn't want to see anyone or do anything. I think part of this side effect of not eating is you have such a lack of energy, which makes you resent everything. It gave me really bad depression and anxiety because my brain wasn't being fueled, and so I'd have anxiety about things that I never had before. I mean, separation anxiety, you know, it can stretch to every part of your life, even though people think it's just your eating, just your exercise. It stretches to every corner of your life. You know, you don't want to meet up with friends because food might be involved. I didn't want to ever leave my parents' side because I was worried about something happening to them. I'd sleep in my mum's bed every night because I was convinced something would happen to them. So in that way, emotionally, it's very isolating and exhausting. And physically exhausting as well, obviously, for obvious reasons. You're not eating, so, and your you don't, it's not the same for everyone, but for me, I didn't eat and I exercised a lot, which meant that my body was exhausted all the time. I bruised very easily. My skin was very delicate and cuts wouldn't heal. My nails wouldn't grow. My hair fell out. I was kind of, you know, my teeth were bad, and everything just fell apart for my body, and I was always kind of on another planet. I felt like I was, as I said earlier, I was in a bubble, but physically as well. I couldn't focus on anything. I don't know. There were moments where I had to brace myself just to go outside because I found it so painfully cold that I had to hype myself up just to go outside. So, you know, there are both emotional and physical difficulties to having an eating disorder that I don't think a lot of people know about, because you think that, oh, you're a bit hungry, you're a bit tired because you're not eating, but it's so much more than that.
We've now completed the first module, and before we start the next module, please could you complete some feedback by clicking on the QR code below.